Okay. So very good to see everyone back to this week, and we'll be continuing our exploration of the Analects with the third passage. It's very short, so we can read it out first. The master said, "Clever words and a pleasing appearance are seldom associated with humanity." So the key word is this moral quality of humanity. This humanity in Chinese Ren is actually a concept that we've previously encountered. So last week we discussed the passage by Master You, and it concludes by saying that family reverence and fraternity, are they not the foundation of humanity? So in other words, it's telling us that we cultivate humanity beginning with the family, starting with how we relate to our parents and our siblings. So this was last week. And the week before then, we also talked about this concept, or we saw it at least in this quote, which was the framework of Confucius's learning and teaching. And it says, aspire to the way, hold on to virtue, be grounded in humanity, and immerse in the arts. And of course, this particular term, humanity, is found in the text that we all know and love, the Dizugui. So it's in the outline, which actually comes from the Analects. It's the sixth passage of the first chapter. And the Dizugui outline talks about how we have to be close to those of humanity. And as we know, the key words in this outline then go on to become the chapters. So there's a chapter 6 is all about being close to and close to kind and virtuous people. So in Chinese, 亲人, which is about the idea of, again, being close to those of humanity. So this concept of humanity is no stranger to us, and it's a very central and important concept in Confucian learning. Scholars have considered that Confucius was the first thinker in China to have articulated humanity as a general virtue, a virtue of virtues, you could say that, as an overarching virtue. And they know this because when we look at earlier texts, this idea of humanity is not so prominent. So when we look at something like the Odes, the earliest anthology of verses and poetry in China, in Chinese, the Shi, this concept of humanity, this term only appears twice. If we look at the documents, which is a collection of political writings of early China, that this humanity only is sort of referred to in terms of the benevolence of a ruler. So it was Confucius who was the very first thinker to talk about humanity as a concept, as a virtue that all of us could actually cultivate, that all of us should be aspiring towards. And Mencius later explains that that's because humanity is actually an innate moral quality that we all have. It's just needs to be realized, just like manifesting our enlightened virtue. So humanity is one of these innate qualities that we have. And Confucius and his learning program, the aim was to really uncover this, bring it out, and to use it in our daily lives. Now, unsurprisingly, it's everywhere in the Analects. It's actually seen in 60 passages of the Analects, and I've just provided a very small selection here, just to give you an idea of what Confucius says about humanity. And you'll find that he doesn't provide precise definition. It seems as if the meaning of humanity is quite elusive. There's no stock standard or textbook definition. And, you know, how he characterizes humanity is very much based on who he's talking to and when. So the way I see it, it's almost like when, you know, we go to a doctor and we ask this doctor, you know, how is it that I can achieve good health? And of course, the doctor doesn't give the same answer to everyone, right? Because everyone comes with different issues and they also have a different baseline of health that they start from. And therefore, it's the same with Confucius. His teaching is tailored to each individual student, and he's very aware of their different temperaments. He knows what their strengths are and where they need to improve. And so when he answers them about how they can practice humanity, how they can be the best that they can be in terms of moral excellence, he tries to push them beyond their comfort zone, beyond, in areas where they actually need to do more work. So that's why there are so many different responses. And as a result of all of these different responses, the English translations of this term are also varied, as you can see here. I've only provided a small selection. Now, in this talk, I generally refer to Ren as humanity, but that also may change on the context, and if it does change, I'll let you know. So let's go back to the third passage, and you'll notice that it talks about humanity, but in association with speech and also our appearances. And what I want to do at the beginning of today's talk is really explore about 4 passages which also deal with humanity in speech and see, whether we can find the underlying principle here. So it's considered a very important idea, this clever words and pleasing appearance being seldom associated with humanity, so much so that we actually find it repeated in the Analects. It's repeated in chapter 5, but also in chapter 17. And in chapter 17, it's repeated, it's identical to how it's stated in chapter 1. You might ask, why is it repeated? And commentaries have provided us with 2 reasons. The first is that it provides evidence of this compilation process, because we know now that the Analects as a book didn't really sort of come together in the same time and place. What happened likely is that there was a series of manuscripts, sort of notes from different students and second generation, third generation students that were compiled and edited across several generations. And therefore, repetition was, an outcome of this process. Now, you might be wondering, well, why was it that in those days, the transmission of text was quite a laborious process? We couldn't just print books at the touch of a button. They had to be copied out by hand. Now, why is it that, they didn't just exclude unnecessary repetition like these quotes? And this leads us to the next reason that some people have suggested, that, perhaps this was an idea, an instruction that Confucius thought was very important, and therefore he reiterated it. And probably in the notes of the students that they probably had it written down several times as well. And so whoever edited the Analects felt that it was important to leave it in there, to remind the reader that this was something that Confucius felt was important. And that's why we're reading it 3 times in the Analects. So this concept is central to Confucian thought. What does it mean? First of all, what are clever words? Well, these are words that are consciously chosen to create an effect, to take advantage of someone, and so that we can get what we want. So that's clever words. And you'll notice in Chinese, it's 巧言. This term 巧 is also found in the 弟子规, and there it's been translated as to speak insincerely or to have this deceptive speech. So it's translated differently, but again, you can see that the underlying connotation is negative. It's about, crafting our words and being manipulative. So this is clever words. What about a pleasing appearance? Now, this appearance in Chinese, 色, is also something that we've seen before last week when we were talking about the attitude that matters when we help out our parents. we said that in Chinese, 色难 literally means that it's difficult to maintain an amiable facial expression. So 色 is a facial expression. And if we bring that back to this idea of a pleasing appearance, we can see that, with our facial expressions, we can look concerned, we can look happy, excited, empathetic, etc. So we can change how we look. And what it's talking about here is it's not a pleasing appearance, but it's an appearance that's designed to please. It's designed to fawn or flatter others so that we can take advantage of them. Now, as you can see, the common denominator for both these behaviors, words and appearance, is insincerity and, intentions that are self-serving. So they look kind, but actually they're not. So Confucius tells us very directly that humanity is not found in clever words and pleasing appearance. And he tells us not to, put an effort in these areas of our life. Unfortunately, this wasn't just the case during the times of Confucius, but even today. Many people still put in a lot of effort into their words and their appearances. So, for example, working on our public speaking, our public relations, networking strategies, or what to say in a job interview. So all of these skills, well, they're not misguided, but they're really missing the main point. What's the main point? It's our thoughts. So it's the genuineness of our thoughts and the sincerity of our thoughts that's the most important. And so Confucius in The Highest Learning tells us that our thoughts make the world. That's the most important. That is the root, that is the priority. So we can actually use our knowledge of the highest learning to try to understand the Analects. So if we remember this diagram, if I was to ask you what we've just talked about, words and appearances, which level of this diagram would it relate to out of the 8 different levels, words and appearances? Well, clearly it's part of level 5, the self, the physical self, because we use our words and our behaviors to communicate and interact with the outer world. And the self from level 5 upwards is relating to the outer world. But we also talked about how the mind is the master of the body. So we shouldn't really be, refining the self and refining our words. What we should focus on and what the priority really is in the level 1, level 2, perfecting our knowledge, detecting thoughts arising, and then perfecting them. So that is the root cause. That is, as we've talked about many times in the highest learning, that is the real reasons, underlying origin of our self-satisfaction, of personal happiness. As you can see, cultivating the self. It also leads to harmony within the family, regulating the household, and social stability, and so on and so forth. So that is the underlying cause of what we want in terms of, a successful life, a fulfilling life. And so that's why in the Deeds of Wei, it tells us a person of good character is highly respected. Respect is not based on external appearances. So what do we need to work on? Our character, this cultivation, which begins with our thoughts and perfecting knowledge, etc. And it tells us that a capable person will naturally have a good reputation. We don't need to work on our words. We don't need to try to sell ourselves with self-praise and boasting about ourselves. And in a way, character and capabilities are really 2 sides of the same coin. Because if we work on our character, if we are conscientious in, developing our skills, developing our capabilities, then that will naturally help us to contribute to society. And it's this contribution through our hard work that will lead to respect and reputation. So in a way, it's answering that question in the passage, the third passage, that, what's the opposite of these clever words and pleasing appearance? Well, what do we need to work on for our humanity is good character and our capabilities. So it's very clear when we put 弟子规 and the Analects together. So ultimately, tells us how we practice this instruction. And more importantly, when we read anything in the Analects, when we read anything in the 弟子规 or the 4 books or the 5 classics, it's all about reflecting on ourselves. We shouldn't use these ideas to then go and judge others, to try to detect, is this person using some sort of false appearances, false promises, putting on an act, etc., and trying to second guess their intentions. We have to realize that all of these instructions are really to better ourselves, to improve our own thoughts and give us guidance so that we know where to direct our thoughts at any one time. So, for example, if we find ourselves thinking, what do I need to say to get in the good books of this person? Then we should immediately remember this passage and perfect our knowledge and put a stop to that thought. Instead, flip our thoughts and think about what I can do to help this person, what I can do to contribute to the organization I'm part of or contribute to the community. So it's not about what we can get at our self-serving or self-interest. It's about what we can do for others, and that is this humanity. So this theme continues in the next passage. Here, someone says to Confucius, 软庸 is humane, but not eloquent. Confucius says, what's the use of eloquence? Those who direct others with an agile tongue create many enemies. Whether Ran Yong is humane, I don't know, but he certainly has no need for eloquence. So Ran Yong was a student of Confucius. He was born in the same state as Confucius. And despite coming from a very lowly, poor background, he later becomes a chief minister to one of the noble families of the state. In the Analects, we see that he's constantly praised by Confucius, and he's well noted for having good character. So much so that, in this passage, someone believes that Ran Yong possesses this quality of humanity. But this person also has this misconception that a person who's good, who has good character, should also, be able to speak well, have the gift of the gab and be eloquent. So it sort of brings to light some of the underlying misconceptions of that time, and probably why Confucius wanted to be clear that clever words were in no way related to humanity, this idea that we saw in the previous passage. So we can see from this that people's subjective opinions about, who is worthy, who is virtuous, cannot necessarily be reliable. Whereas Confucius, who's well learned, he's read these ancient texts, he's been taught by several teachers, he's got a more objective standard of what eloquence is and what is humanity. So let's look at his answer. He first debunks this myth of eloquence being associated with humanity and the fact that eloquence is some sort of virtue. So he says, what good is eloquence? What's so good about it? And in fact, it's interesting because when we look at earlier texts, eloquence actually has a positive connotation. It's not simply to do with words, but it can also refer to someone who's very skilled, like a craftsman, or someone who's articulate. So just being talented in general. But during the spring and autumn period, during the time of Confucius, it starts to develop a negative connotation. So someone who's just sweet talking and insincere. So this is what Confucius is getting at. So what's the use of, having the gift of the gab? And he explains it such that he understands that people have this misconception. And it's actually in the very form of the characters themselves. So let's look at these two characters. And can you spot the difference? So yes, it's quite obvious, isn't it? The eloquence on the left has an added component on the right-hand side. But you can see, of course, it's actually derived from the character of humanity. Now, just like this, the character of eloquence can be mistaken for humanity. Well, someone who is eloquent could also be mistaken, or was mistaken, for someone of moral excellence, someone who possessed humanity. So, and that's because, what they say, the words that they say sound so good, and you think that they really care, when actually they don't. They're just really in it for themselves. So that's why Confucius wants to try to drive these two concepts apart and say that, eloquence is not related to humanity. It's not a virtue. And on top of that, he says, those who direct others with an agile tongue create many enemies. So not only is it not a virtue, but it's also very dangerous, this habit. An agile tongue refers to someone who's fast talking, very persuasive. They can win any argument, even if they're quite unreasonable. And I'm sure that we've all had some experience with such a person. You say one thing and they come back with 10 reasons and you just give up, let them win the argument. They're always right and, everyone else is wrong. So that kind of a person, yes, they might be able to talk a lot and come up with a lot of reasons, but it actually creates resentment. And that's why Confucius says they create many enemies because they're always, winning the arguments. So it's quite dangerous. And then he continues by saying, well, as to the other claim that, Ran Yong is humane, I'm not really sure about that. In other words, he's actually denying that Ran Yong is a person of humanity. Why is that when he himself praises Ran Yong? Well, in fact, when we look through the entire Analects, you'll notice that Confucius never sort of says or confirms that anyone possesses this quality of humanity. He himself denies possessing humanity. The only people that he sort of talks about having humanity are people in the past, historical figures. And why is that? Well, humanity is not some sort of trophy. It's not realized in one day or one particular achievement. Humanity is something that is a lifelong process, and it's cultivated in our every moment of our lives. And it's really an evaluation given by others at the end of our lives. It's not something that we might necessarily feel that we have, but it's something that others, through their objective judgment, might consider us to have at the end of our lives. So it's something that, would only be possible to evaluate after this person has passed away. And, as a teacher, Confucius is also very benevolent in the sense that he's always wanting his students to improve. So, he doesn't say whether or not they have humanity because he wants them to constantly keep working at themselves, constantly cultivate. And, it is a lifelong kind of quality that we have to learn and cultivate. So that's the reason why he says that, even though Ran Yong is a good person, has no good character, he's not necessarily has this moral quality. And then finally, he continues, he repeats himself. He says, well, I'm not sure whether he has humanity, but I'm definitely sure that he has no need for eloquence. And it really emphasizes the fact that eloquence really has no bearing with humanity. This idea of, manipulating our words, crafting our words, etc. So, what is eloquence, and why is it that many people want to be eloquent? Well, being good with our words is actually a skill. It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used for positive or negative outcomes. Let's take, for example, Confucius. When he's teaching his students, when he's talking to the state rulers and politicians, he also has to think on his feet. He has to debate and be persuasive. And you could say that that is one kind of eloquence. However, there's another kind of eloquence. For example, if we're trying to get a promotion, and every time we talk to the boss, we try to flatter them, praise them, etc. Well, that kind of eloquence is the type that Confucius is warning us against. And it's quite a slippery slope. The moment that we're, very good with our words, we know the effect that it creates on others, then we can use it for our own means. The difference is with, the negative type of eloquence is that our intentions are self-serving, and, we're using our words for our own self-interests. And that's got nothing to do with humanity. Why? Because humanity is about serving others, and it's about being selfless. So that's why we have to be very careful in our words, but in particular, know about and analyze our underlying intention behind these words. And that's what the exemplary person does. They try to think about creating sincere intentions, so much so that it's not about what they say or how much they say, but even saying a few words has a very immense impact. So this is the second passage. And the third passage that we're going to cover, again about humanity and speech, is a conversation between another student, Sima, and Confucius. Sima asks about how to practice humanity. Confucius says, "One who practices humanity is reluctant to speak." Sima is quite surprised. Reluctant to speak, and that's humanity? Confucius says, well, when the practice of something is difficult, how could one speak about it lightly? So there's actually a background to this conversation that we need to know. Sima, yes, he's a student of Confucius, but he's actually from another state, the state of Song. And his brother, God Huantui, is plotting to overthrow the government of Song. And in fact, all his siblings are actually involved in this plot as well. He's the only one who's not involved, and obviously because he's in the state of Lu with Confucius. And so he's really worried for his family. And in a way, he's stuck in a moral dilemma. Like, should he side with his family or should he side with the state? So Confucius understands his predicament. He knows about Simanuel's family revolting against this government and the fact that this is a crime. And so he tells Simanuel to be very careful and cautious about what he says and who he talks to when he's trying to seek advice. And, be careful not to expose the conspiracy. And so this is the word that he uses when he talks specifically to Simanuel about the practice of humanity. And the Chinese word is pronounced as ren, which is made up of two parts, as you can see. On the left is the character for speech, and on the right is the character for blade. And originally it was meant to sort of convey this concept of a blunt knife. So just like a blunt knife can't really cut through anything, you have to, use it several times, slice it several times before it cuts through. Similarly, when we associate it with our speech, it refers to, not being able to get our words out, being at a loss of words, and therefore this reluctance to speak, as it's translated here. But it could be translated as a loss of words as well. So he's trying to tell Simanuel that you have to be very cautious and careful about what you say. And not only that, you have to think before you say. Think about who you're talking to, what you say, and how they might react. Because, in his case, it involves a criminal offense. And so it might actually implicate the person who's listening, or at the very least make them very uncomfortable and worried about Simaniel, his family, or themselves for having, interacted with Simaniel. So for us, of course, generally, when we have problems, we have complaints and we talk to others, we're generally, wanting them to provide some sort of help or advice or even to comfort us, right? So this is important, but we also have to understand how they might feel hearing about our problems. So we really have to consider the feelings of others before we open our mouth and share with them, particularly about our problems. And this idea of being very cautious and careful and considerate about the feelings of others, that in itself is the practice of humanity, one of the practices of humanity. This feeling, this mindfulness of how others might react. So we have to be cautious in our speech. And there's this extract from the Records of Ritual which explains it very well. So it says here, when an exemplary person, so an exemplary person is someone who is cultivating themselves. We said in the lectures on the highest learning, someone who's studying the highest learning. They want to be morally excellent. So when this person is next to someone who's mourning and cannot contribute to their expenditure, they don't ask about it. Right? So someone who's mourning, they've lost their loved ones. There's probably a lot of expenses, funeral ceremony, burial, cremation, etc. And these are large sums of money. So, if you can't help support them financially, then don't ask about the expenses. When an exemplary person is next to someone who's ill and cannot supply them with food, they do not ask what they like. Again, same idea. If you can't do something, don't even mention it. When an exemplary person has a visitor they cannot provide lodging for, they do not ask about their accommodation. Now, in those times, travel was very difficult and dangerous, and you might have to stop, several times during your journey. Or when you get to your destination, you might have to stay several months or weeks to months, for example. And so this providing accommodation is not just the lodging, it's also the food, but also the hospitality. So if you don't have the means to do that for at least a few weeks, then don't mention it, because maybe the person really doesn't have a place to stay. And they would be really hoping that, they could stay with you. So you can see from, just these three situations, the exemplary person is very careful about what they ask about. And this is not even making a promise. This is just mentioning something based on understanding the feelings of the other person. And so it concludes here that the exemplary person, when the exemplary person asks about those who are suffering from cold, they clothe them. Or those who are suffering from want, they feed them. And when the exemplary person praises another's good qualities, they go on to confer rank on them. In other words, everything that they say is genuine. Now, why is that? Because before they say it, they anticipate what's going to happen, what are the consequences. And then they only say it if they can make good on their words, as in they can, fulfill the promise, or, go ahead with offering accommodation, etc. And so we have to be the same. If we're learning to be an exemplary person, if we want to be exemplary, then we shouldn't have any empty words. If we have no ability, then we shouldn't say anything. We shouldn't mention it. It's often better to speak less or ask other questions. So with that in mind, if we look back then at this particular line in the Deeds of Way, it has much more depth. Here it says, is better to talk a little than chat too much. Tell the truth and do not speak insincerely. But now we understand, well, why is it that we can't talk too much? Because maybe what we say can be insensitive. So not speaking or speaking less, this reluctance to speak that Confucius advised Simanyal, is not because we're shy, it's not because we're antisocial, but because of a deeper consideration of the feelings of others. So before, how would you feel if someone told you their brother was a criminal? Or how would you feel if someone, asked you about, your expenses, and then at the end of you telling them all your expenses, they say they can't really help you anyway? Why burden someone with getting them to tell you about expenses when you can't help? So, if someone does that to us, we would think that they are insensitive. And Confucius tells us that they are insensitive because they really should have this empathy and think first before they open their mouth. So behind our every word should be a deeper empathy and knowledge of what our words might mean for ourselves, but also, more importantly, for others. How will they be affected with our worries, for example? And this is also important in the next passage. Now, this is very short. Confucius says, firmness, resolution, simplicity, and slowness of speech. These bring us closer to humanity. Okay, so 4 qualities or 4 attitudes. Firmness is being steadfast in our endeavors, being faithful to our goals, and so much so that we are unwavering. We're not swayed in terms of our being true to our principles and our objectives. So this firmness is not being stubborn and obstinate in our views, but it's having this inner mental strength. And it comes about because we don't have selfish desires. We're not swayed because we don't have these self-interests. And this firmness is important regardless of our circumstances. So that's the first, you would say, attitude that Confucius says is quite important. The second is being resolved. And this is, having the courage to do what's right in any situation. Simplicity is quite interesting. If we look at the Chinese character, it's actually the character for tree or wood. And there's a term in Chinese which means to be wooden or really dull-minded. And in some ways, in a contemporary setting, that would be quite an insult. But in the times of Confucius, and what Confucius means here is to be more simple, simple-minded, and simplifying our thoughts, getting rid of some of the more cunning and clever ways of thinking, ways we can take shortcuts and try to get our way. Reduce some of those thoughts, be more simple, and just, think about others more than calculating and thinking about ourselves. So this is the idea of simplicity. And then slowness of speech, which we've sort of talked about before, but here it's really saying that, it's not about reluctance, it's actually saying that we don't necessarily have to respond very quickly to others, and that might make us look slow or inarticulate, but that's because we're actually considering the deeper implications of our words before we say it. We're considering, can we make this promise? Can we say yes? Can we do this? And therefore, this slowness of speech is actually a virtue because it means that our words are honest and sincere. So whatever we say, we're able to fulfill that, we're able to do it. So firmness, resolution, simplicity, and slowness of speech, they aren't exactly humanity, but by cultivating them, by training ourselves, that brings us closer to humanity. And we'll see a little later why that's the case. So these 4 passages specifically talk about humanity and speech. And, it's very interesting so far. If we recap, it's telling us that humanity is not related to eloquence, clever words, or pleasing appearance, but it's about the intentions behind our words, and more importantly, sincere intentions to help others and to consider the effect of our words on others. And sometimes that might make us come across as being slow or inarticulate, but actually that's okay, because the ultimate outcome is that we are honest and sincere. So that's what we might gather so far about humanity. And what I want to do is to just take a step back and think about what we talked about last week in terms of family reverence being the starting point of humanity. Why is that? Well, let's look at it in relation to these passages. So in our family, when we relate to, how we interact with our parents, with our siblings, they can see right through us. They know what we're thinking, even if we don't say anything. So in actual fact, clever words and pleasing appearance and, eloquence really means nothing to our family members, because what's more important is that we deliver on what we say. We do what we say. So that's why, clever words are not in any way related to family reverence. And that's why they are not in any way related to humanity. So can you see that? If we start by training ourselves in family reverence, we'll slowly, realize that this is what humanity is as well. And then when we train ourselves in the family, in terms of understanding and considering the feelings of others, that's often the easiest, because we know our siblings and our parents the longest. We can understand how they feel when certain things happen, and because of that, how we say things, our choice of words changes, because we're considerate of their thoughts. And that is actually the start of humanity, being able to consider our words, make choices in our words that have a positive effect and show concern for others. So that's why you can see that this idea of humanity begins in the training that we receive in the family, how we deal with our family members. Okay, so that still hasn't really told us what is humanity, though, hasn't it? So this is the next passage we'll look at, what humanity is. And it's a conversation between the student Zigong and Confucius. Read it out first. Zigong said, "If someone could extensively confer benefits on the people, is able to assist all, what would you say of them? Could that be called humanity?" Confucius then says, "Why bring humanity into the discussion? They are certainly a sage. And even King Yao and King Shun had trouble doing that much. A person of humanity is one who, wishing to establish oneself, helps others to establish themselves, and wishing to understand, helps others understand. To correlate one's conduct with those close at hand, this can be called the approach of humanity." So first of all, who is Zigong? He was actually quite a wealthy merchant, and later went on to become a very successful statesman. He, because he's quite wealthy and also quite excellent in terms of, he's quite eloquent, he often feels very proud of himself. And you can see that in the way he talks to Confucius here, when he just sort of has his own idea of what humanity is, or what a person of humanity is. And then he sort of tries to ask Confucius to confirm his ideas, like, I'm right, aren't I? And Confucius here tells him that no, he's not really correct. But you can see that he's very confident with himself. So he says, this is his idea. He says that a person of humanity is someone who is able to confer benefits, and not just to people in their family, extensively and to all, means not just in the community, not just in the state, nor the Chinese kingdom, but even beyond the Chinese kingdom. So everyone. This person can help everyone alleviate suffering and lead a fulfilling life. Okay, so this is Zigong's idea of a person of humanity. They can do this. That's his standard. And so Confucius tells him immediately that no, You're overstating, you're inflating the concept. It's not that difficult. And not only are you not providing the definition of humanity, this is also not the definition of a sage. Because, as Confucius said, King Yao and King Shun, who were recognized sage rulers in antiquity, even they had trouble being able to do what Zigong says. We know during the times of King Yao's reign, there were great floods, and for many years, and the people were suffering. So even King Yao was not able to ensure that everyone could have a fulfilling life. So Confucius sort of pares it back. He says, well, you're overstepping the mark. This is really not humanity. Humanity is so much more achievable. Don't make it sound so difficult. Humanity begins with ourselves. Person of humanity, they want to establish themselves first. Establishing oneself is to cultivate oneself, to manifest one's enlightened virtue. Okay, and when they do that, they do that with a view to help establish others, to help others cultivate, to help others manifest their enlightened virtue. And this person of humanity doesn't just think about themselves in terms of this cultivation. They also think about thoroughly understanding the teachings and the texts, as well as any knowledge or skills that might be beneficial to others. So this is what it means to understand. And when they understand, then they can help others understand. So you see how here, it's not just thinking about yourself, it's also thinking about yourself and others at the same time. And so when we look back at those 4 values of firmness, resolution, simplicity, and slowness of speech, they were simply about qualities for ourselves and had nothing to do with others. So that wasn't humanity. It was only bringing us closer to humanity. Humanity is when we think of others as ourselves. So there's some people would find that there's a seeming contradiction. So do we think of ourselves or do we think of others? If we have to establish ourselves first, is that not selfish? If we have to manifest our own virtue first, is that not selfish? Well, let's use a very simple example. For example, if you're training to be a teacher, okay, obviously you have to learn first before you can help others. That's very logical. I'm sure no one has any difficulty understanding that. That's the same way that we have to manifest our own enlightened virtue before we can help others, before we can love all others, right? But there are 2 ways in which we can study to be a teacher. One way is we're thinking, we have to study really hard so that, whatever we learn, we can pass on, we can teach others, and so that we can really nurture and develop the talent of others. So that's one way. Another way of thinking about it is to say, well, I want to study really hard so that I can get a good pay package at the end when I graduate. So you can see that both of these ways motivate us to study hard. But one of these ways is consistent with, wishing to establish oneself. They help others establish themselves, and the other one isn't. So you can see the difference. The difference is in the motivation. So when you're doing something for yourself, you're actually doing it for others. And that's this others, this idea of thinking about others is quite interesting, because it's really just in our thoughts. The actions, what we're doing, is exactly the same. So establishing yourself, that's important. Everyone wants to do that. But humanity is then to think about and be considerate of others at the same time you're doing this, and use it as your underlying motivation. And this others begins, as it says here, correlate one's conduct with those close at hand. So the others, the so-called others, begins with our family, those who are closest to us. And out of our family, our parents, because they've nurtured and developed us, particularly in those first years of our life, so much. So we have to be considerate of them first. And then as we're considerate of our family, we then extend these feelings beyond the family to the community, etc. Like these ripples in the water that form, ever increasingly large concentric circles. So the training begins within the family, with those who are closest to us. And what happens is that we're mindful of them. Okay, so let's use an example from the Deeds Way. It says, if we injure ourselves, we make our parents worry. If we do something unvirtuous, they will feel ashamed. So yes, we have to look after ourselves. We have to develop our character. But we do this not for ourselves, we do it for our parents. Okay, so when we, in this diagram of, detecting our thoughts, perfecting our knowledge, when thoughts arise, I want to go somewhere, I want to take some shortcuts, dangerous shortcuts, well, then we recognize that thought and we think, are we doing it for ourselves, or should we be thinking about our parents and not making them worry? And if we can think of our parents, particularly in the early years of our life, when maybe the people that we look up to most are our relatives, our parents, if we can think of them, then our intentions will be sincere, our mind rectified, and we will be cultivated. And then when we grow up, when we're in the workplace, it's not just our family we have to worry about, but all others. And then we simply change this thought to all others. But we train ourselves first by thinking of our parents. So that is what humanity really is. This recognizing the thought for self or for others. And humanity is obviously considering others. And that is encapsulated by the very character of humanity itself. So humanity is very simple, made out of two parts, left and right. On the left is character for person or human. On the right is the character for two. But it doesn't mean two people, it means all others. So when we think of ourselves, we should actually be thinking of all others. And we extend that from our parents to our siblings, to our extended family, to our neighborhood, to our workplace, to everyone in our community, to everyone in our country, and then ultimately everyone in the world. So when we think of everyone in the world, that is truly unleashing this, uncovering our humanity. And what's really interesting when you look at the words is that the character of a person is in this character for humanity. Humanity is what is characteristic of being human, just like in the English words. Human, humanity. Humanity is made up of the word of human. So humanity is characteristic of being human. And what's even more interesting is the English humanity is a collective noun for all of the human race. So when we develop this humanity, this moral quality, we're actually developing a sensitivity to all of the human race, to everyone. We're always thinking of the greater good for all others. So ultimately, that's because Confucian learning is not about writing good poetry, writing prose, taking exams, or reciting. Confucian learning is about creating a better world. This is Confucius's vision, as recorded in the Li Zi, the records of ritual. It says that all people respect and love. So his ideal world of great harmony, is when all people respect and love their parents and children, as well as those of others. 2, the aged are cared for life. Adults realize their full potential and make full use of their abilities. And children are raised with care. Widows and widowers, orphans and the childless, people with disability and illness are all supported. So you can see, it begins with the nuclear family, so they love and respect their own parents, their own children, and then it extends to all parents. You see other parents as, caring in the same way. And then this care occurs in all stages of our life, from the young to the aged. And on top of that, people who don't have families, the widows, the widowers, orphans, etc., are also cared for. So these are the most vulnerable people in the community. So Confucian thinking, this humanity, begins in the small, you could say, the words, the conduct of our lives, and how we think about them, our intentions, our thoughts, that we train ourselves within the family. But ultimately, the effect is if everyone learns this, then everyone will be cared for, everyone will have consideration for each other. So you can see here that from this particular passage, it extends our understanding of, it wasn't just about words, it was also about this consideration. And this consideration begins with ourselves and cultivating ourselves. But we cultivate ourselves, we look after ourselves by thinking of others, by thinking about, okay, well, once I cultivate myself, I can help a lot of people. And that's what motivates me. I learn this, not for myself, but I'm learning this because I have to help, see all these people who don't understand, who don't learn, who don't have this opportunity. And I learn and I work really hard to be able to help them. So you can see how that thinking is, yes, it's about yourself and the fact that you have to put in effort for your own learning, but it's a motivation that is sustainable because it's not about some award, it's not about some recognition, it's about a lifelong kind of project that is about others, and others is a lot of people. So that's why it occurs throughout your life. But it's also a very joyful thing as well because you know that you're doing it with a purpose and with a meaning. So as it says here from this passage, to correlate our conduct with those close at hand. This is the technique. So this is the way we approach it. So yes, there's these grand goals, but how do we approach it? In the everyday moments of just thinking about, how would this person feel? Am I sensitive to this person's feelings? And we start with those who are closest to us. We use our own feelings to think about, well, how might they feel? And it's a negotiation process because how you might feel may not necessarily be how they feel. But over time, you get experience. So you realize, oh, okay, they feel like that. That's how my parents might feel. Then, everyone in that age generation, that age gap, that generation might also feel the same way. And then you can infer. So this is a continuous process of training yourself, inferring, and trying to be able to think about how they feel, which eclipses how you feel, which eclipses your own selfish feelings. So by doing that, you are approaching humanity. You're actually on your way to becoming a person of humanity, which is the great goal, the great aspiration of Confucian learning. So I might stop there given the time. So hopefully today, through the 5 passages, you've got an idea of this idea, how humanity and words and appearances, how they relate or how they don't relate, and then a clearer picture of, okay, well, how do I actually go about humanity, developing and practicing humanity, given that this is such a central concept in Confucian learning. So yes, I'll leave that today, given the time. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.